Hello, my name is Joseph Diorio. This is my speech one about my culture for Com 101 with Joe Hassert. And here are my flashcards. And here is my studio audience. Thank you. All right. Well, we're going to start this off by asking you how many Catholics have ever visited Lebanon, a vastly gorgeous country known for the amazing cedar trees that it has and some of the various different cultures and traditions that it follows. And I'm sure a lot of you, and one person in my studio audience, has probably a culture that they belong to that they're very familiar with. Well, for me, it is my Maronite culture. Well, my Maronite culture was quickly divided into two people, monolitheists and Chalcedonians. And so Maronites have always followed the Chalcedonian rite. And so what does the Chalcedonian mean? Well, so the Maronites in my culture had a lot to do with two aspects of Christianity in the Eastern Catholicism, was the two natures of Christ. And the two natures of Christ that were highly discussed in the Crusader era and around the time when the Maronites had first gathered from their branch, which is the Assyrians, was, does Christ have two natures? And they concluded that he does. And so the two natures that the Maronites in my culture believe in is the divine and the human part of Christ. And so this has been the view of the Maronites for a long time. It's been a view that they've held, and it's one that they hold deep into their roots and cultures of traditions. So who are the Maronites? Well, the Maronites are Assyrian Christians. And who are the Assyrian Christians? The Assyrian Christians are these groups of people that speak Aramaic, that speak Syriac, that come from Syria. And the founder of the Maronite Church was Saint Maron, or Father Maron is what we call him, or we say in my language, Saint Maron. He was the founder of the Maronite Church. He was originally an Assyrian hermit. He was an Assyrian monk, and he grew up in Syria, and he gathered a big following for being not only a hermit, but being a priest, and before he was a priest, he was a deacon, gathered many followers, and because, like I said, because of that persecution that was happening, he moved into the mountains of Lebanon and formed what we know today as the Maronite Catholic Church. Now, some are like, well, why did the Maronite Catholic Church come about? Well, the Maronite Catholic Church overall started because of his great influence over the people of Lebanon. Over the people of Lebanon in the way of Christianity, the way of the liturgy that it follows from Syria. It had a great deal of inspiration over the East. And so the Maronites have always had that Assyrian root to them. And so you have two branches of Assyrian. You have the East Syriac rite, which would be the Chaldeans, the Melkites, which are actually of Greek culture. Then you have the West Syriac, which is from Syria, which would be the modern-day Maronites or Western Assyrians. It has something a lot to do with the dialect of how they talk. And so the way they speak Aramaic. And so Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. And so there was a lot of empires that came against the Maronites. Obviously, the Roman Empire was a big influence on the Maronites in the East. And they also had the Ottoman Turks, which heavily persecuted the Maronites. They were persecuted a lot, and you have two stories, once of the Masubki brothers that were three brothers, actually. I almost said two, but there were three brothers that were persecuted in a church by the Ottoman Turks and by the Muslims because of their faith. And so they went into the church one day. Well, one of the brothers was offering the mass, and they held them at ransom, and they ended up, unfortunately, losing their lives for their faith. So they're considered one of the martyrs of the faith. So the Maronites as well fought a lot of persecution. from the time of Saint Maron all the way down to the time of the Masubki brothers in Syria and Lebanon. And so Lebanon overall, with including the Maronites, has suffered a lot of persecution. And of course, the Ottoman Turks were one of them, and the other ones were the Crusaders. The Crusaders were a big, big part of not only the martyrdom of the Maronites, but actually a lot of people don't realize that if it wasn't for the Crusaders that had invaded Lebanon and persecuted the Maronites wouldn't actually have the unity with Rome that they do. So obviously, if you go back into church history and to the time of Saint Maron, the church was started by the roots of the Apostle Peter in Antioch, and from Antioch all the way to Syria, and then from Syria into Lebanon. So Saint Maron has always followed that type of apostolic lineage. And so what happened after the Church of Rome was established, and it's where we call it the See of Peter because where he's buried, the Maronites ended up taking lineage from Peter, and because of the pope that was the sitting pope in the time of the Crusaders, the Maronites ended up becoming in full union with Rome. So it's a long history of the Crusaders and the Maronites, but one important aspect or fact that I do want to point out about the Crusaders and the Maronites is that the Crusaders and the Maronites, as much as they were persecuted, they persecuted each other, the Maronites became more united or in full communion with Rome because of the persecution that they went through. And the Crusaders, they themselves had a lot of good things that they did, but they also heavily persecuted Christians. And so that is one of the basic aspects of how the Maronites formed and the type of persecution they endured to get to where they are. And so the church continues to use Syriac as its language. So this is often a question I get by a lot of people is, in my culture, you guys speak Arabic. Yes, we do speak Arabic. Arabic is what we call our modern day liturgical language. But Syriac is the original Syriac Aramaic. Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, in my culture has become more of a privileged thing to use, so we only use it in rare instances during the Mass. And so Syriac is what we call the old formation of the liturgy. And so we still retain originally, although we don't use it as often, we still retain Syriac Aramaic as the language of the church, the official language of the church. And so during the 18th century, there were attempts to Latinize the Maronite Catholic Church. And this was very problematic. And why do I say it was problematic? Because we had our traditions. We had the things that we did that were accustomed to our culture, that we followed. And so you had a lot of cardinals in the East who attempted to Latinize the Maronite Church. And so this was very problematic, as I mentioned. And so an olive branch was extended by the Pope in that time to say that the Maronites needed to keep their tradition. They needed to keep who they are and where they came from in order to preserve that second lung of the church, or that second lung of my tradition, which is our Eastern, our Syriac, our Aramaic speaking culture that has a long history and formation. So our goal was not to become, although we were in union with Rome, and we still are in union, our goal was not to become like the West. Our goal was to stay as Eastern as we could, yet we always maintained that communion with the Holy Father in Rome. And so that's where we come from. As Maronites, we are Assyrians. We take many, many different traditions from the West, like we have married clergy. So in the East, a priest may marry before he is ordained. Typically, before he is ordained as a deacon, and then as a deacon he becomes to a priest. They are allowed to be married before, but not after. And usually those who are married cannot advance to the Synod of Bishops, which is becoming a bishop or a cardinal. They usually stay as they are usually a parish priest, and they cannot enter religious orders like a hermit or a monastic life. And the monastic life in the Maronite Church comprises of a group of men who have devoted their life completely to God as priests and as religious. So they sit in caves all day and they offer their lives to God, and they take care of each other as monks and hermits. It's a very monastic lifestyle. Well, that is a little bit about my tradition as a Maronite Catholic. And so I want to thank you guys all for listening. And as to conclude this speech, I would like to say that my Maronite culture has a lot to resemble with who I am, not only because I've grown up in it, and not only because I have been in my Maronite culture all my life, but because it is the mystical aspect of the Maronite faith. It is the mystical aspect of the Maronite faith, the Mass, the way we offer Thanksgiving in the Holy Mass and in the Holy Eucharist, that really, really, really means a lot to me and how I interpret the Catholic faith. Thank you.
Good job. Wow.